Never underestimate the chaos that starts when someone mistakes ragu for a mythical American condiment. The mythology of gravy, that mysterious American substance allegedly masquerading as tomato sauce, has achieved a level of narrative importance that would make ancient alchemists weep with envy. According to the more imaginative theories, Fudio's transatlantic mission had less to do with business and far more to do with espionage. Not political espionage, of course, but culinary. The Italians, baffled by this so-called gravy, supposedly dispatched him to the United States to uncover what, exactly, Americans were doing to tomatoes that rendered them unrecognizable to European palates. The confusion is understandable. Even an Italian waiter, positioned as the supposed cultural authority, appeared unaware that gravy meant anything edible at all. An omission that conveniently buttresses the idea that the substance is utterly alien to Italy. The American explanation, that gravy is simply tomato sauce, only deepened the mystery. One can imagine the investigative committee in Naples staring at a ladle of marinara and wondering where, precisely, the gravy was hiding. Then there is the legend of Polly's survival in the Pine Barrens, reportedly sustained not by grit or skill, but by ketchup packets. Packets that, in this theory, share the same arcane properties attributed to gravy. The logic follows effortlessly. If ketchup can preserve Polly in subarctic wilderness, imagine what it could do for an organized crime syndicate seeking an edge. Hence the mission. Fudio, culinary scout extraordinaire, sent abroad to secure an arsenal of condiment sachets and usher in an era of tomato-based super soldiers. Of course, reality insists on intruding. Gravy, in its traditional usage, refers to meat sauce, essentially a ragu, hardly an elixir of immortality. Yet the mythology persists, buoyed by linguistic confusion, cultural pride, and the irresistible comedy of imagining hardened mobsters treating ketchup like contraband plutonium. If nothing else, it proves this. In certain circles, the debate over what to call tomato sauce can escalate faster than any territorial dispute, and with significantly more imaginative world building. Everyone insists Tony was assassinated, but there's a far more humiliating culprit, and it came fried. The mythology surrounding Tony Soprano's final moments has inspired endless speculation, but the more mundane explanation was delivered long before the diner lights flickered. Dr. Christopher Natural Canopy Moltisanti, cardiologist, prophet, and reluctant voice of reason, forecast that Tony's diet would ensure a heart attack by age 50. And in the end, Tony remained true to form, wheezing heroically and consuming onion rings in quantities that would make a cardiology textbook weep. A poetic exit, if one's definition of poetry includes LDL cholesterol levels that qualify as chemical warfare. Yet there persists a competing narrative in which Tony is dispatched by an all-star coalition of the aggrieved, the departed, the imaginary, and the animated. This roster includes Furio, Butchie, Little Carmine, Polly, Patsy, Dr. Melfi, Artie, Noah, a telephone tough guy, Silvio's comatose form, the half-eaten corpse of Big Pussy, Phil's ghost, the Season 1 Ducks, Walter White, Michael Corleone, Carla from Scrubs, Jake Peralta, Mickey Mouse, and, naturally, Tony Soprano himself. A veritable Avengers lineup of vengeance, united by nothing except the insistence that Tony must have been whacked because, well, it would feel satisfying. In this version, the end arrives silently and instantly. He orders for the table, looks up, and takes a bullet to the face. Justice served family style, as cold as the onion rings were hot. Everyone present witnesses the spectacle, and apparently, everyone agrees he and his family had earned the privilege. After all, they spent years reaping the benefits of the empire while politely stepping over the bodies of those who paid the price. Thus, the final image. A man dying violently before the loved ones who convinced themselves they lived in a separate, safer universe. Whether he collapsed from coronary collapse or evaporated in a hail of metaphysical gunfire, the thematic message is the same. Denial is a fragile shield, and the world Tony built always collects what it is owed, quietly or catastrophically. Here's why Tony's sweetest moments tell you more about his darkness than his humanity. Tony Soprano's defenders often cling to one shining virtue. He never badmouths Carmela to the children. In a household built on denial, deceit, and the occasional federal investigation, this apparently qualifies as saintly conduct. He urges Meadow and AJ to respect their mother, assures them she wants the best for them, and even explains her emotional turmoil with the tender gravitas of a man who, when convenient, remembers he has a family. Of course, this touching display of paternal diplomacy is then immediately undercut by everything else he does. The children are not blind. They see the marital rot he cultivates. They witness the serial infidelity, the checked-out husbandry, and the contempt delivered not through words, but through behavior. Unsurprisingly, they mirror it. The pattern becomes predictable. Mistreat Carmela, escalate, deflect, storm off, re-emerge with a half apology and a store-bought olive branch. Then repeat, as though marital stability were a treadmill set to futility. Yet, this is the perennial trap of Tony Soprano. He performs just enough superficial benevolence to invite the illusion of decency. An encouraging word here, a moment of contrition there. The viewer is tempted to wonder whether he is merely a flawed man, battered by circumstance. Perhaps even one worth rooting for. But the illusion collapses the moment one steps back far enough to see the full portrait. A sociopath whose humanity flickers only because the surrounding landscape is even more monstrous. Still, the myth persists. The man almost shoved his wife through a wall during one of their darker chapters, but fear not, he refrained from insulting her in front of the kids. In certain corners, this apparently qualifies as proof of a good guy, a noble patriarch who always did the right thing. After all, he even had his mistresses tested for diseases. What more could anyone possibly ask for? It is a revealing metric of morality. The bar is not low so much as subterranean, and Tony clears it with room to spare. Forget everything you assumed about why Johnny Sack was always hanging around Tony's crew. Johnny Sack's social calendar has always presented an intriguing puzzle. Here stands the underboss of a major New York crime family, an ostensibly busy man with real power to consolidate, rivals to monitor, and a criminal empire to help steer. Yet he spends an astonishing amount of time loitering around New Jersey social functions as if he's the unofficial maitre d' of the Bada Bing. Dinners, celebrations, homecoming parties for men who aren't even made. Johnny appears at them with the dedication of someone punching a loyalty card. Yes, there's the oft-cited friendship with Tony, but even that hardly explains the frequency. One might expect an underboss to maintain a degree of mystique, or at the very least, a New York zip code. Instead, he is the lone representative of the Lupertazzi family at nearly every Jersey gathering, drifting into scenes where his presence makes about as much hierarchical sense as a CEO attending every middle management birthday lunch. Of course, there are practical explanations available for those who enjoy tidy narratives. The Lupertazzis and the DeMeos share lucrative business interests. Someone has to ensure New York's investments aren't quietly siphoned off by enterprising Garden State entrepreneurs. Maintaining a close working relationship with Tony provides additional leverage against threats from other New York families. It is also true that the real-world inspiration, likely the Genovese family, maintained extensive operations in New Jersey, making such interstate fraternizing less bizarre than it appears. Others prefer gentler interpretations. Perhaps the Jersey crowd is simply a more pleasant hang, especially compared to whichever dimly lit Manhattan restaurant is hosting New York's latest funereal supper. And it is undoubtedly possible that escaping Ginny's household vigilance provides its own incentive structure. But the show offers a more pointed clarification. Federal agents lay it out without hesitation. Tony's influence bleeds into New York, supported by his capos and at least 2 New York families, all channeled through none other than John Sacramone. The arrangement is no casual friendship. It is a strategic alliance with its own gravitational pull. Johnny isn't merely visiting. He is the emissary, the conduit, the man ensuring that New York's interests are threaded neatly through the chaos of New Jersey. So yes, the underboss seems omnipresent across the river, not because he is lost, bored, or confused, but because the power structure quietly demands that he be. Never mistake fragility for innocence, especially when Livia Soprano walks into the scene. Livia Soprano remains one of television's most quietly audacious subversions, a masterclass in weaponized frailty. She enters the narrative as a withered silhouette, the sort of character typically destined for sympathy and soft lighting. Instead, the facade peels back to reveal a master manipulator whose influence permeates every corner of the story, often without the other characters realizing they've been maneuvered like chess pieces. Even her supposed bouts of dementia arrive with such convenient timing that they read less like cognitive decline and more like another tool in her arsenal. The brilliance lies in the contradiction. Manipulators on screen are usually presented as glamorous geniuses or operatic villains. Livia, meanwhile, looks as though a strong breeze could take her out. Yet the fragility becomes part of the performance, an understated camouflage that makes her ruthlessness feel disturbingly plausible, as if she could step straight out of fiction and into the real world wearing the same blank stare and cutting remarks. Her departure leaves a vacuum that the narrative dutifully fills with 20 uninterrupted minutes of Chrissy's existential rambling, a reminder of just how much sharper the show is with Livia's scalding presence. For all the years the characters, and the audience, spent under her psychological yoke, the end of Season 2 still has the audacity to evoke sympathy. That owes much to Nancy Marchand's performance, which remains a small tragedy in itself. A Season 3 centered on a direct Tony versus Livia collision promised a level of darkness the show never again had the chance to reach. Livia is, in essence, a textbook narcissistic mother, volatile, manipulative, and perversely mesmerizing. She functions simultaneously as villain and comic relief, the rare character whose cruelty and absurdity share the same oxygen. Her backstory only deepens the complexity. A miscarriage endured alone while her husband delegated emotional labor to a child does not excuse who she became, but it does explain some of the rot beneath the surface. A real gangster, one might say, though she never needed the title. She ruled her domain with nothing but a withering gaze and a lifetime of weaponized grievance. A dark character indeed, maybe the darkest precisely because she never had to raise her voice to cast a shadow. Never credit a character's power when the staging makes him look stranded in a coat closet. Phil's grand idea of menace, lurking in a motel closet like an understudy waiting for his cue, remains one of the series' most unintentionally comedic achievements. His dramatic emergence, followed immediately by his spectacularly undignified demise, forms a 1-2 punch of unplanned slapstick. The man could have simply confronted Vito with his entourage the moment the lights flicked on. Instead, he opted for theatrics, a carefully staged closet entrance, made all the more absurd given the show's pointed hints about the closet he inhabited in a more figurative sense. The moment raises logistical questions that undermine any hope of intimidation. How long was he standing in that closet, rehearsing menace in the dark? Did his men discreetly peek through the curtains to whisper the equivalent of, "He's here, he's here," before scurrying back into position? Was he expected to wait indefinitely, perhaps perched on a folding chair like a disgruntled mall Santa, in the event Vito failed to arrive on schedule? And what if Vito hadn't shown up at all? Imagine Phil and his crew fast asleep in the motel room while Vito spent the night elsewhere. It is difficult to maintain the aura of ruthless executioner when the big reveal involves men snoring in lawn chairs beside a half-open closet door. Of course, there's always the indignant protest. A man was beaten to death. One of us, as the show pointedly reminds. Indeed, and the tragedy is unquestioned. But the staging of that particular moment remains a masterpiece of unintended farce, an operatic attempt at menace that collapses under the sheer weight of its own clumsy pageantry. Looking for the real reason Schlommo's 25% offer spiraled into a catastrophic miscalculation? Schlommo's decision to stroll into a New Jersey crime syndicate's social club and graciously offer them 25% of his motel remains one of the more inspired acts of self-sabotage ever committed by a supposedly seasoned community patriarch. His son-in-law Ariel refuses to grant a religious divorce. The usual rabbinical enforcers have been shut down by federal intervention, and yet, rather than simply paying for help, Schlommo presents a permanent stake in his livelihood as if he were gifting a fruit basket. Predictably, chaos follows. The crew extracts Ariel's agreement after 2 beatings and a threat, an efficiency Schlommo somehow interprets as a cue to show up at Satriale's and announce that their successful execution of his exact request now obligates them to nothing. Having achieved precisely the outcome he commissioned, he attempts to revoke the terms and behave as if the entire arrangement were a passing courtesy. The logic is baffling. Schlommo owns the business. Ariel never had authority to sign away 25% of anything. The predictable outcome, the very one Schlommo asked for, could only lead back to him. On what grounds did he imagine reneging would be consequence-free? Why not simply offer a straightforward payment from the start? Even his socially ambitious son understood that a fractional ownership arrangement with mobsters is not something one introduces lightly, unless the goal is to inadvertently summon an entire executive game's worth of trouble. The internal rationales offered for Schlommo's behavior are equally dubious. One theory posits he hoped Ariel's temperament would get him seriously harmed, thus relieving him of further obligations. A charming plan, except the crew would still expect their cut regardless of anyone's medical status. Another explanation suggests Schlommo believed the entire matter was a tidy, transactional favor he could unwind as easily as canceling a plumber once the drain clears. A naive assumption, particularly for someone who has spent a lifetime in New Jersey and counts Silvio Dante among his acquaintances. The more generous interpretation is that Schlommo disastrously misread the situation. After negotiating Ariel down to a 12.5% concession, he decided that his own successful bargaining somehow nullified the original arrangement. Perhaps the $50,000 he later offered was meant as a diplomatic gesture, a belated realization of how badly he'd misplayed his hand once he learned just how persuasive Silvio and Polly had been with Ariel. Then there is the timeless tactic of creative accounting. It requires no imagination to suspect that Schlommo intended from the beginning to produce books so barren that 25% of the motel's earnings would amount to nothing. A long-term strategy of stonewalling and fiscal opacity is, after all, less painful than an upfront cash payment, at least until the patience of one's new partners evaporates. In the end, the simplest explanation prevails. Schlommo underestimated the criminal professionals he approached, overestimated his ability to outmaneuver them, and operated under the delusion that a binding agreement with organized crime could be treated like a flexible suggestion. It was season 1, and apparently everyone was still warming up, but even so, this particular misjudgment stands out as an act of almost heroic short-sightedness. Carmela and Furio didn't fail to have an affair because of morality. They failed because Furio had more honor than the entire New Jersey crew combined. The great irony of the Carmela-Furio almost romance is how spectacularly easy it would have been for them to cross the line, and how spectacularly oblivious the household patriarch remained throughout. At Furio's father's funeral, an elderly relative boasts that the bosses always know everything, a charming sentiment that collapses immediately upon contact with Tony Soprano, a man who rarely knows anything that isn't shoved directly under his nose. His marriage is no exception. The notion that Carmela might stray never even occurs to him, not because of trust, but because he simply cannot imagine her as an autonomous adult capable of making choices he hasn't pre-approved. His inattention is matched by his condescension toward Furio, whom he regards as an exotic accessory, an obedient import with decorative European quirks. The man could have been serenading Carmela across the breakfast table in sonnets, and Tony still wouldn't have glanced up from his pastry. The morning flirtations, the loaded looks, the gentle cultural connection, all conveniently hidden by the boss's own incuriosity. Even the fact that Furio was building an entire American life, complete with plans to bring over his mother, would have required Tony to notice anyone's interiority but his own. The supposed obstacles to the affair were laughably minor. No, AJ was not poised to uncover the grand secret. The child could barely track his own academic schedule. The only real deterrent was the pair's shared hesitation, a hesitation that, in Carmela's case, stemmed less from moral clarity and more from chronic dissatisfaction in search of its next outlet. The priest in one season, the brooding Italian in the next. Longing becomes a hobby when life offers so few actual choices. For Furio, the calculus was different. His restraint was not born of fear, nor of American social complications, but of something the New Jersey crew treats like an antique: honor. In the American mafia ecosystem, where loudness passes for strength and cruelty passes for leadership, Furio stood out precisely because he embodied what the others pretended to be. He respected the code, the culture, the seriousness of the life, in ways that made the rest look like suburban hobbyists in tracksuits. To him, sleeping with the boss's wife wasn't a victimless thrill. It was a violation of the identity he'd carried across an ocean. And yes, there was affection between them, even attraction, though not the sweeping, operatic love some insist on projecting. Carmela's appeal to him fit neatly within his own values: the ideal wife, the devoted mother, the cultivated woman Tony routinely reduced to background noise. She embodied the kind of domestic dignity his culture prized. She also represented a version of Italianness her own mother would have approved of, which didn't hurt. But the deeper emotional connection often attributed to them is far less certain. Carmela's longing seemed more like a craving for escape, any escape, from the deadening predictability of her gilded captivity. Furio, meanwhile, appreciated her, admired her, perhaps even cherished her, but also saw the danger of becoming exactly like the men he quietly disdained. In the end, the non-affair became more revealing than any actual betrayal could have been. Carmela glimpsed a world where masculinity did not default to boorishness, and Furio glimpsed the risk of losing himself to the very moral erosion he fled. Their restraint, frustrating as it may be for eternal what-if theorists, was the last remaining evidence that someone in that universe still understood the meaning of a line one chooses not to cross. Subscribe for more.